When I saw the little girl run up and call my husband Daddy in front of 80 guests, I realized my life was about to explode. But let me tell you something. I didn't cry. I've been waiting for this moment for months and I was ready. Picture this, a perfect engagement party. Fairy lights strung between ancient oak trees, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, champagne flowing like water. Everything glowing, everything pristine, everything exactly as I'd planned it to be. My daughter Sarah's engagement party, the culmination of months of careful planning, the celebration of her finding true love with David. I'd spared no expense. Nothing was too good for my baby girl. The guests were mingling, laughing, celebrating. The cream of our community was there: judges, business owners, doctors, teachers, people who'd known us for decades, people who respected Richard, my husband of 25 years, people who saw us as the golden couple, the ones who'd made it work, who'd built something beautiful together. I was standing near the champagne fountain, watching Richard give one of his charming speeches about love and commitment, when I saw her, a woman I didn't recognize, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. They were walking through the garden gate like they belonged there, like they'd been invited. My first thought was confusion. Who were they? Had Sarah invited someone I didn't know about? But then I saw Richard's face when he spotted them. The color drained from his cheeks. His confident smile faltered for just a split second. And in that moment, I knew. I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that makes your blood turn to ice. The little girl broke free from the woman's hand and ran straight toward Richard. Her voice carried across the entire party, clear as a bell. "Daddy, Daddy, you said you'd be at my school play, but you weren't there." The silence that followed was deafening. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. 80 pairs of eyes turned to watch this scene unfold, this moment that would shatter everything we'd built. I watched my husband's face cycle through emotions: panic, confusion, desperate calculation. He looked at me, then at the crowd, then back at the little girl who was now tugging on his jacket, and I saw him make the choice that would seal his fate. He was going to lie. Even now, even with the truth standing right in front of everyone, he was going to try to lie his way out of it. "I think there's been some mistake," he started, his voice shaking just enough for me to notice. "I don't know this child." But I did. Oh God, I did. Because I'd been staring at photos of her for 3 months. I'd traced every bank transfer, every secret payment, every lie that had funded her existence. I knew her name was Emma. I knew she was 7 years old. I knew she loved ballet and had his eyes and called him Daddy every single day of her life. That's when I stepped forward. That's when I decided that 25 years of marriage, 25 years of trust and partnership and building a life together, deserved better than watching him lie to a crowd of people who'd respected us both. "Then maybe," I said, my voice carrying across the stunned silence, "you'd like to explain why your other wife just walked in." The gasps were audible now. Someone dropped their glass. I heard it shatter against the stone pathway. The woman near the gate, Emma's mother, looked as confused as everyone else. She was staring at Richard with growing horror, and I realized in that moment that she didn't know either. She had no idea that the man she'd been living with, the man who'd fathered her child, was already married. It was time to let everyone see what he'd hidden. It was time to stop protecting the lie that had been eating me alive for 3 months. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story doesn't start with that little girl calling my husband Daddy. This story starts 3 months earlier, when I was still living in a dream, still believing in the fairy tale we'd built together. 3 months earlier, I was the happiest woman alive. My daughter Sarah had just gotten engaged to the most wonderful man, and I was throwing myself into planning the perfect engagement party. After 25 years of marriage, Richard and I had everything we'd ever wanted. Our daughter was successful, beautiful, kind. Our marriage was solid, or so I thought. Richard was respected in our community as a successful financial advisor. I had my part-time accounting practice, enough to keep me busy, but flexible enough to be there for my family. We were the couple other people envied. 25 years together, and we still held hands. We still laughed together. We still said, "I love you," every morning and every night. I was proud of what we'd built. I was proud of the woman I'd become, the mother I'd been, the partner I thought I was. Our house was beautiful, a colonial we'd bought when Sarah was just a baby and renovated over the years into something straight out of a magazine. Richard's home office was on the first floor, filled with awards and certificates from his financial firm. My smaller office was upstairs, where I handled the books for a handful of local businesses. We had routines: coffee together every morning before he left for work, dinner together most evenings, unless he had client meetings, weekend projects in the garden, date nights once a month religiously, because we'd read in some marriage book that you had to keep nurturing your relationship. I thought we were happy. I thought we were solid. I thought 25 years meant something. But now I can see the cracks that I missed, the signs I chose to ignore because I trusted him completely. The business trips that seemed to increase over the past few years, the way he started taking certain phone calls outside, walking into the garden when his phone rang, the way he'd suddenly become very interested in cash transactions, suggesting we use cash for dinners out, for weekend getaways, for things that used to go on our joint credit card. "It's better for our taxes," he'd say, with that charming smile that had won me over 26 years ago. "Cash transactions don't leave the same paper trail." I believed him because he was the financial expert in our family. I believed him because I loved him. I believed him because after 25 years of marriage, why would I doubt the man who'd stood by my side through everything? But the biggest sign, the one that should have woken me up, was how he'd started being more attentive, more romantic, bringing me flowers for no reason, suggesting weekend trips to nice hotels, taking me out to expensive dinners, and insisting on paying cash. It felt like a second honeymoon phase, and I was so grateful for it. I thought we were growing closer as we got older. I thought he was appreciating what we had. Now I know he was managing his guilt. Every bouquet of flowers was an apology for where he'd been the night before. Every romantic dinner was his way of balancing the scales for the other life he was living. Every "I love you" was his way of convincing himself that what he was doing wasn't destroying everything we'd built. The business trips became more frequent. "Expanding the client base," he'd explain. "There's a whole untapped market in the neighboring counties. I need to build relationships there." It made sense. Richard had always been ambitious, always looking for ways to grow his practice. He'd travel to meet potential clients, sometimes staying overnight if the meetings ran late. "I don't want to drive 2 hours after a long client dinner," he'd say. "It's safer to just get a hotel room and drive back in the morning." I admired his dedication. I was proud of how hard he worked for our family. When he'd come home tired from these trips, I'd have his favorite dinner waiting, his favorite wine chilled. I'd rub his shoulders while he told me about the new clients he was courting, the deals he was working on. I was the perfect wife, supportive, understanding, proud. I managed our household, handled the logistics of our life together, and gave him the space he needed to build his career. And every single day, he was lying to my face. The phone calls were subtle at first. He'd always taken business calls, so when his phone rang during dinner or while we were watching TV, I didn't think much of it. But gradually, I noticed he'd step outside to take them, or he'd go into his office and close the door. When I'd ask about them later, he'd wave it off. Difficult client, he'd say. You know how it is. They want to discuss their financial anxieties at all hours. I need to give them privacy to really open up about their concerns. Again, it made sense. Financial planning is intimate business. People share their deepest fears about money, about security, about providing for their families. Of course, those conversations would be private, but sometimes when he was on those calls, I'd hear his voice change. It would get softer, warmer, not the professional tone he used with clients, but something more personal. When I'd mention it, he'd laugh it off. Mrs. Henderson is 83 and lonely, he'd explain. She needs someone to talk to as much as she needs financial advice. It's part of the service. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was unthinkable. Because after 25 years, you don't just start suspecting your husband of having an affair. You don't just throw away everything you've built together because of a feeling, a suspicion, a small nagging voice in the back of your head. But that voice was getting louder. The cash thing started bothering me more. Richard had always been meticulous about our finances, about tracking every expense, about making sure we were maximizing our tax benefits. He'd taught me to save receipts, to categorize everything, to think about the financial implications of every purchase. So when he suddenly wanted to pay cash for everything, it felt wrong. When he'd suggest we use cash for groceries, for gas, for dinners out, I started asking questions. I thought you said it was important to have a paper trail for tax purposes, I'd say. Things change, he'd reply. I've been reading about financial privacy, about protecting ourselves from identity theft. Cash transactions are actually safer. He always had an answer. He always had a reason. And he was the expert, not me. My accounting work was small scale, local businesses, nothing compared to his sophisticated financial planning practice. So I deferred to his expertise, even when my gut was telling me something was wrong. The night everything changed started like any other. Richard had been on one of his business trips, supposed to be back by dinner time. But 6 o'clock came and went, then 7, then 8. I called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Traffic must be terrible, I told myself, or the meeting ran late. I kept his dinner warm in the oven and settled in to watch TV, checking my phone every few minutes. At 10:30, I finally heard his car in the driveway. I went to greet him, ready with a warm smile and a kiss hello, but he looked exhausted, drained. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair messed up, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Sorry I'm so late, he said, barely meeting my eyes. The meeting went longer than expected, and then there was an accident on the highway. Traffic was backed up for miles. I believed him because I had no reason not to. I heated up his dinner while he went upstairs to shower, and we spent the evening like we always did. He told me about his day, about the clients he'd met with, about the prospects for new business. I told him about my day, about the planning I'd been doing for Sarah's engagement party, about the local business accounts I was managing. It felt normal. It felt like us. It felt like 25 years of partnership and love and building a life together. But at midnight, his phone buzzed with a text message. He was in the bathroom brushing his teeth, so I glanced at it reflexively. The preview on the lock screen made my blood freeze. Emma had a great time at the park today. She keeps asking when Daddy's coming home. I stared at that message for what felt like hours. but was probably only seconds. Emma, a child named Emma who called Richard Daddy. Richard, who had never had any children except Sarah. Richard, who was married to me and only me. My hands were shaking as I set the phone back down exactly where he'd left it. I climbed into bed and lay there in the dark, listening to him finish his nighttime routine, listening to him settle into bed beside me like nothing had happened. "Good night, honey," he whispered, kissing my cheek. "I love you." "I love you too," I whispered back, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, trying to come up with innocent explanations for that text message. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was from a client with a confused child. Maybe I'd misread it in the dim light. But deep in my heart, I knew. I knew that my husband of 25 years was living a double life. I knew that everything I'd built my identity around, being his wife, being part of our partnership, being half of our golden couple, was a lie. The next morning, I watched him over our coffee, searching his face for signs of deception. But he was the same Richard he'd always been, charming, attentive, asking about my plans for the day, kissing me goodbye before he left for work. "I'll probably be late tonight," he said as he gathered his briefcase and car keys. "I'm meeting with the Andersons about their retirement planning, and you know how detailed they like to get." "Of course," I said, smiling like the supportive wife I'd always been. "I'll keep dinner warm." But as soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I ran upstairs to my office and opened my laptop. I needed to know the truth, even if the truth was going to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The discovery phase was like opening Pandora's box. Once I started looking, I couldn't stop. And what I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. It started with that bank alert that came through 3 days after the text message. We had joint accounts, and I'd set up notifications for any transactions over $500. Richard usually handled the bigger financial decisions, but I liked to stay informed about our money. The alert was for a child support payment. $1,000 automatically debited from our checking account with a reference number I didn't recognize. Child support. We didn't pay child support. Sarah was our only child, and she was 25 years old and financially independent. This had to be a mistake. Maybe some kind of identity theft or banking error. I called the bank immediately, ready to dispute the charge and get our money back. But when I spoke to the customer service representative, she confirmed that it was a legitimate automatic payment that had been set up 2 years ago. 2 years ago? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Set up by whom? By Richard Mitchell, the account holder, she replied. Would you like me to provide you with the details of the payment schedule? Yes, I said, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The payment schedule made me physically sick. $1,000 every month for the past 2 years. $24,000 of our money, our retirement savings, our future going to support a child I'd never heard of. But that was just the beginning. Because I'm an accountant, and once I start following a money trail, I don't stop until I understand every transaction. I spent the next week going through our bank statements with a fine-tooth comb. I found patterns I'd never noticed before, or maybe patterns I'd chosen not to see. Cash withdrawals on the same days he had business trips, hotel charges in towns he'd never mentioned, restaurant bills for 2 people when he was supposed to be traveling alone. And then I found the second checking account. It was at a different bank, one we'd never used before, but it was linked to our main account for automatic transfers. $500 every 2 weeks, moving from our joint savings into an account I'd never known existed. I called that bank too, pretending to be Richard's assistant and saying I needed to verify some account information for tax purposes. The account had been open for 3 years. The address on file wasn't our address. It was in a town 40 minutes away, a place called Millbrook that Richard had never mentioned. I drove to Millbrook that afternoon, telling myself I was just curious, that I needed to see this address to understand what was happening. Maybe it was connected to his business somehow. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. The address was a small apartment complex, nothing fancy but well maintained. Building C, Unit 7. I sat in my car across the street for 2 hours, not sure what I was hoping to see, not sure what I was afraid of finding. And then she came home, a woman with long brown hair and a warm smile, holding the hand of a little girl who looked to be about 7 years old. They walked up to Building C, Unit 7, and I watched them go inside like they belonged there, like it was home. The little girl had Richard's eyes, Richard's nose, Richard's smile. I sat in my car and cried for the first time since this nightmare had started. Not just tears, but ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. 25 years of marriage, and I was looking at his other family, his other life, his other wife, because I was sure that's what she was. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, the casual intimacy of their routine. This wasn't an affair. This was a relationship. This was a life they'd built together. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When Richard came home that evening, I looked at him and saw a stranger. This man who'd shared my bed for 25 years, who'd raised our daughter with me, who'd built our life and our future with me. He was also building a life and a future with someone else. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my cheek like he always did. "Fine," I managed to say. "How was yours?" "Good. Productive. I think I'm close to closing that big client I've been working on." Lies. All of it was lies. He was probably with them today, with his other wife and his other daughter, playing daddy to a little girl I'd never heard of, husband to a woman who probably thought she was the only one. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay next to him, listening to him breathe, wondering how long this had been going on, wondering how many lies he'd told me, wondering if anything about our marriage had been real. The next day, I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, like something out of a movie, but I needed proof. I needed to understand the scope of what he'd done, what he was still doing. I needed evidence that would hold up in court, because I was starting to realize that this wasn't just about infidelity. This was about fraud, about using our joint assets to fund a secret life, about putting our financial future at risk. The private investigator was a woman named Janet Reyes, recommended by my cousin Michael, who's a divorce attorney. Janet was professional, compassionate, and thorough. She didn't judge me for staying in my marriage while she investigated my husband. She understood that I needed time to process what I was learning, time to plan my next steps. What Janet found was worse than I'd imagined. Richard had been living a double life for 10 years. 10 years. Not a recent affair, not a midlife crisis, but a decade-long deception that had started when our daughter was still a teenager. The woman's name was Lisa Torres. She was 34 years old, worked as a nurse at the hospital in Millbrook, and genuinely believed that Richard was divorced. He'd told her that he was going through a messy separation when they met, that his ex-wife was difficult and vindictive, that he was waiting for the divorce to be finalized before he could move on with his life. For 10 years, he'd been telling her that the divorce was almost complete. For 10 years, she'd been patient and understanding, waiting for him to be free to marry her. For 10 years, she'd been building a life with a man who was already married to someone else. They'd had a commitment ceremony 5 years ago, not legally binding since he was still married to me, but meaningful to them. They'd exchanged rings, made vows, promised to love each other forever. In Lisa's mind, they were married. In her heart, Richard was her husband. And Emma was their daughter, born 3 years after they met. Richard was listed on her birth certificate as the father. He attended her school events, her doctor's appointments, her ballet recitals. He was, by all accounts, a devoted father and loving partner, except that he was also married to me. Janet showed me photographs that made my stomach turn. Richard at Emma's birthday party, wearing a World's Greatest Dad t-shirt. Richard and Lisa at what looked like a romantic dinner, holding hands across the table. Richard pushing Emma on a swing at the playground, both of them laughing. He looked happy in these pictures, genuinely, completely happy, like this was the life he'd chosen, the family he wanted. There's more, Janet said gently, spreading out additional documents on the table between us. This isn't just about the personal relationship. There are financial implications you need to understand. She was right. The financial fraud was staggering. Richard had been using our joint assets to fund his double life. Not just the child support payments I'd discovered, but rent for Lisa's apartment, utilities, groceries, Emma's private school tuition, health insurance, car payments. He'd been systematically draining our retirement savings, our emergency fund, our daughter Sarah's college fund. He'd taken out credit cards in both our names without telling me, using them to pay for his expenses in Millbrook. Family vacations that I thought we couldn't afford because money was tight. Money was tight because he was supporting two households. The most damaging discovery was that he'd been forging my signature on financial documents, loan applications, investment withdrawals, even a second mortgage on our house that I'd never known about. He'd used our home as collateral to fund his secret life, putting our security at risk. This is criminal fraud, Janet explained. Identity theft, forgery, potentially bigamy depending on what kind of ceremony they had. You have grounds for both criminal charges and a very strong divorce case. But I didn't want to just file for divorce and walk away quietly. I didn't want to let him control the narrative, let him spin this as a marriage that simply didn't work out. I wanted everyone to know what he'd done. I wanted Lisa to know that the man she'd been waiting for was never going to divorce me because he'd never told me about her. I wanted our friends and family to know that our perfect marriage had been built on lies. I wanted justice, and I wanted it to be public. That's when I started planning the engagement party revelation. The plan took 2 months to execute perfectly. 2 months of living with a man I now knew was a stranger, pretending everything was normal while I built a case against him that would destroy his reputation and his career. Those were the longest 2 months of my life. Every morning, I had to wake up next to him and pretend I still loved him. Every evening, I had to sit across from him at dinner and listen to his lies about his day. Every night, I had to say, "I love you too," when he kissed me good night, the words burning my throat like acid. But I was strategic about it. I'm an accountant. Organization and patience are what I do. I wasn't going to let emotion cloud my judgment or rush me into making mistakes. First, I met with my cousin Michael, the divorce attorney. I needed to understand my legal options and make sure I was protecting myself financially. What you're describing is serious fraud, Michael told me after reviewing Janet's evidence. He's been stealing from you for years, using your joint assets without your knowledge or consent. In addition to the divorce, you could pursue criminal charges. I want him to face consequences, I said. Not just losing half our assets in a divorce, but real consequences for what he's done. Michael helped me file a secret legal separation, temporarily freezing our joint accounts to prevent further fraud. We prepared divorce papers, but didn't serve them yet. We documented everything, every forged signature, every unauthorized transaction, every lie that had cost us money. When you're ready to move forward, Michael said, we'll have him dead to rights. He won't be able to deny anything or claim it was a misunderstanding. The second part of my plan was more personal. I wanted Lisa to know the truth, not because I blamed her. She was as much a victim of Richard's lies as I was, but because she deserved to know what kind of man she'd been building a life with. Janet helped me contact Lisa discreetly. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our towns, neutral territory where we could talk privately. That conversation was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Lisa was beautiful, kind, and completely devastated when I showed her the evidence of my marriage to Richard. He told me you were divorced years ago, she said, tears streaming down her face. He said you were high conflict, that you were making the divorce difficult, but that it was almost finalized. I've been waiting for 5 years for him to be free to marry me. There was never a divorce, I told her gently. He's been lying to both of us. Lisa's shock turned to anger quickly. She realized that Richard had been manipulating her just as much as he'd been manipulating me. She'd wasted 10 years of her life waiting for a man who was never going to be available, raising a daughter who would now have to learn that her father was a fraud. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to expose him," I said. "Publicly. I want everyone to know what he's done." To my surprise, Lisa wanted to help. She was as angry as I was, as betrayed as I was. She wanted people to know that she hadn't knowingly broken up a marriage, that she'd been lied to just as completely as I had. "Sarah's engagement party," I told her. "Richard will be giving a toast about love and commitment and family values. I think it would be appropriate for his other family to be there." The third part of my plan was the most important: protecting my daughter. Sarah had no idea what her father had been doing. In her mind, we were the perfect family, the example she wanted to follow in her own marriage. I agonized over whether to tell her beforehand, whether to prepare her for what was coming, but ultimately, I decided that she needed to see who her father really was, not just hear about it secondhand. She needed to witness his lies falling apart so she'd never doubt that leaving him was the right choice. I did make sure she'd have support. I quietly arranged for her fiancé David to stay close to her during the party, and I asked my sister Anna to be ready to step in if Sarah needed to leave early. The final piece was the logistics. I needed Richard's other family to show up at exactly the right moment, when there would be maximum impact, and no way for him to spin the situation in his favor. I knew Richard always gave a toast at family events. He loved being the center of attention, loved playing the role of the wise patriarch, sharing his wisdom about love and marriage. The irony of him giving relationship advice when he'd been living a double life for 10 years was too perfect to pass up. I coordinated with Lisa so that she and Emma would arrive during his toast. I wanted the little girl to call him Daddy in front of everyone. Wanted there to be no ambiguity about who they were or what their relationship to him was. I also prepared a grand finale. Michael helped me prepare a legal packet that would be served at the party: divorce papers, asset freezing orders, and a formal complaint to the district attorney's office for financial fraud. I wanted Richard to understand that this wasn't just about embarrassing him, but about holding him legally accountable for what he'd done. The night before the party, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because I was excited. After 3 months of living with the knowledge of his betrayal, after 3 months of pretending everything was normal, I was finally going to be free to tell the truth. Richard spent the evening before the party going over his toast, practicing it in the mirror like he always did before big speeches. He was planning to talk about the importance of honesty in relationships, about how true love requires complete trust and transparency. The irony was so thick I could barely stand to listen to him practice, but I smiled and nodded and told him it sounded perfect, because I knew that in less than 24 hours, everyone would see exactly what his words were worth. The day of the party arrived with perfect weather, sunny but not too hot, a gentle breeze that made the fairy lights dance in the trees. Everything was exactly as I'd planned it: the string quartet, the champagne fountain, the elegant tablescapes that had taken me weeks to design. Sarah looked radiant in her engagement party dress, a flowing cream-colored gown that made her look like a princess. David couldn't stop smiling, and watching them together almost made me forget why we were all gathered here. Almost. The guests arrived in waves throughout the afternoon. Our closest friends, Richard's business associates, my family, people we'd known for decades. Everyone was in a celebratory mood, toasting Sarah and David, complimenting me on the beautiful party, telling Richard how proud he must be of his daughter. If they only knew. Richard was in his element, playing the role of the proud father and devoted husband. He moved through the crowd with that effortless charm that had first attracted me to him 26 years ago, making everyone feel special, telling stories that had people laughing and nodding in appreciation. "You're so lucky to have him," my friend Patricia whispered to me as we watched Richard regale a group with some anecdote about his business travels. 25 years and he still looks at you like you hung the moon. If only she knew where he'd really been on those business travels. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself watching the gate, waiting for Lisa and Emma to arrive. We'd coordinated the timing so they'd appear during Richard's toast, which traditionally happened about an hour into the party. I positioned myself near the champagne fountain where I'd have a clear view of both the gate and the small stage area where Richard would be speaking. My sister Anna was nearby, ready to support Sarah when everything unfolded. Michael was mingling with the guests, blending in perfectly while keeping an eye on the legal documents in his briefcase. At exactly 4:30, Richard tapped his champagne glass with a spoon and stepped up to the microphone we'd set up near the string quartet. "Friends, family, loved ones," he began, his voice carrying across the garden. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this joyous occasion with us." The crowd quieted, turning their attention to Richard. Sarah and David moved closer to the stage, holding hands and smiling. This was supposed to be their moment, their celebration, their perfect day. I was about to ruin it, and I felt a moment of doubt. Was I doing the right thing? Was exposing Richard's lies worth potentially ruining my daughter's engagement party? But then I remembered the 10 years of deception, the $24,000 in child support, the second mortgage on our house, the woman who'd wasted a decade of her life waiting for a man who was never going to be free to marry her. Yes, this was the right thing to do. "Today we celebrate love," Richard continued, warming to his theme. "True love, the kind that builds a foundation for a lifetime together. Sarah and David, you're embarking on the most important journey two people can take together, the journey of marriage." Someone in the crowd murmured, "Hear, hear," and several people raised their glasses. "Marriage is about commitment," Richard went on, and I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing at the audacity. "It's about choosing each other every single day, even when things get difficult. It's about honesty, trust, and building something beautiful together." That's when I saw them, Lisa and Emma, walking through the gate just as we'd planned. Lisa looked nervous but determined, holding Emma's hand tightly. Emma was wearing a pretty yellow dress and looked excited to be at a party. Richard couldn't see them yet. His back was to the gate as he faced the crowd. But I could see the exact moment when some of the guests noticed them, the way conversations paused and people turned to look at these unexpected arrivals. Most importantly, Richard continued, oblivious to the stirring in the crowd, marriage is about family, about creating a legacy of love that will endure for generations. Emma broke free from Lisa's hand and started running toward the stage, just like a 7-year-old would when she saw someone she loved. Her voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent garden. Daddy, Daddy, you said you'd be at my school play, but you weren't there. The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation stopped. Every glass froze halfway to lips. Every eye in the place turned to watch this little girl run toward my husband, calling him Daddy. Richard's face went through a series of emotions so quickly, I almost missed them. Shock, panic, desperate calculation, and then a kind of resigned terror as he realized there was no way to explain this away. I think there's been some mistake, he said into the microphone, his voice shaking. I don't know this child. But Emma was already tugging on his jacket, looking up at him with those eyes that were so obviously his. Daddy, why are you saying that? Mommy said we were coming to see you. The crowd was starting to murmur now, confused whispers and shocked gasps as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. That's when I stepped forward. That's when I decided to end 25 years of marriage with the truth. Then maybe, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence, you'd like to explain why your other wife just walked in. The gasps were audible now. Someone dropped their champagne glass. I heard it shatter against the stone pathway. Sarah's face had gone white, and David was holding her steady as she swayed. Richard stared at me with something like hatred, and I realized that this was the first time I'd ever seen his mask slip completely. This was who he really was underneath all that charm. Angry, cornered, desperate. There's been a misunderstanding, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. This woman is clearly confused. But Lisa was walking toward us now, and the confusion on her face was giving way to understanding as she took in the scene, the elegant party, the shocked guests, the woman who was clearly his wife standing next to him. Richard? She called out, her voice uncertain. What's going on? Who are all these people? The crowd was starting to put the pieces together now. I could see it on their faces. The dawning realization that the man they'd respected for decades, the man they'd held up as an example of integrity and success, had been living a lie. Everyone, I said, my voice steady and clear, I'd like you to meet my husband's other family. The chaos that followed was everything I'd hoped for, and more devastating than I'd imagined. The explosion of voices was immediate. Shocked exclamations, confused questions, the sound of someone crying. But underneath it all, I heard Sarah's voice, small and broken, saying, Daddy? Like she couldn't understand what was happening. That almost broke my resolve. Seeing my daughter's face crumble as she realized her father wasn't who she thought he was. That was the hardest part of this whole nightmare. But then I remembered that she deserved to know the truth. She deserved to see who her father really was before she built her own marriage on the foundation of his example. Richard was trying to salvage the situation, but it was like trying to hold back a dam with his bare hands. Lisa was staring at him with growing horror as she understood that he'd lied to her about everything. Emma was clinging to his leg, confused and scared by all the commotion. Richard, Lisa said. her voice cutting through the noise. You told me you were divorced. You told me your wife was out of the picture. Lisa, please, Richard started, but she cut him off. You've been lying to me for 10 years, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I've been waiting for you to be free to marry me, and you were already married this whole time. The crowd was riveted now, watching this real-life drama unfold in front of them. Some people were pulling out their phones, recording this moment that would undoubtedly be all over social media within hours. That's when Michael stepped forward with the legal documents. Richard Mitchell, he said formally, you're being served with divorce papers, asset freezing orders, and a formal complaint for financial fraud. Richard took the papers with shaking hands, and I watched his face as he realized the scope of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about embarrassing him at our daughter's engagement party. This was about destroying him completely. You can't do this, he said, turning to me with desperation in his eyes. Please, we can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. Fix this? I said, my voice rising with the anger I'd been holding back for 3 months. You've been stealing from me for years. You forged my signature. You took out loans in my name. You used our house as collateral to fund your second family. There's nothing left to fix. The crowd gasped again as they processed this new information. Financial fraud was something they could understand, something that made Richard not just an unfaithful husband, but a criminal. You've been living off our retirement savings, I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. Our daughter's college fund, our emergency money. You spent it all on your other life, while I was cutting coupons and suggesting we eat out less to save money. You were paying for private school tuition and family vacations with a woman you weren't even legally married to. Lisa looked sick. The school tuition, she whispered. The vacations, the nice apartment. You said your business was doing really well. His business was doing well, I said bitterly. Well enough to support one family, but not well enough to support 2 families and maintain the lifestyle he wanted. So he stole from me to make up the difference. Richard was looking around wildly now, like he was searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. 80 people had witnessed his lies falling apart. There was no way to spin this, no way to charm his way out of it. Please, he said, and I realized he was crying. Please don't do this to me. I'll make it right. I'll pay everything back. Just don't destroy me like this. You destroyed yourself, I said coldly. I'm just making sure everyone knows what you did. That's when Emma started crying, overwhelmed by the tension and the shouting and the way all the adults were acting. Lisa picked her up, holding her close while glaring at Richard. You've traumatized my daughter, she said. Our daughter. She's going to grow up knowing her father is a liar and a fraud. Their daughter, someone in the crowd whispered, and I could hear the pieces clicking into place for people as they realized the full scope of Richard's deception. Sarah finally found her voice. Dad, she said, and her tone was so flat, so devoid of emotion, that it was scarier than if she'd been screaming. Is it true? Do you have another family? Richard looked at our daughter, our beautiful, innocent daughter who'd looked up to him her whole life, and I saw him make one last desperate attempt to lie his way out of this. Sarah, sweetheart, it's complicated. I can explain. Is it true? She asked again, cutting him off. I watched Richard's shoulders slump as he realized that even his own daughter could see through his lies now. Yes, he whispered. It's true. The sound Sarah made was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part sob, part scream, part wounded animal. David caught her as she collapsed, holding her while she cried for the father she'd lost and the family she'd thought she had. That's when I felt the first crack in my composure, seeing my daughter's heart break in real time, knowing I was responsible for causing her this pain, even though I'd done it to protect her from even worse pain down the road. But there was no going back now. The truth was out, and there was no way to put it back in the box. Richard was surrounded now by shocked guests, by Lisa demanding answers, by Michael explaining the legal consequences he was facing. But his eyes were on me, and for the first time in 3 months, I saw him clearly. Not the charming financial advisor, not the devoted husband and father, but the selfish, calculating man who'd built his happiness on other people's trust. 25 years, I said to him, my voice carrying across the chaos. 25 years of marriage, and you threw it all away for what? For the excitement of living a double life? For the thrill of getting away with lying to everyone who loved you? It wasn't like that, he said desperately. I love you both. I never meant for it to go this far. You never meant to get caught, I corrected. That's what you never meant. You were perfectly happy to keep lying to both of us for the rest of our lives. Lisa was nodding, tears streaming down her face. 10 years, she said. 10 years I waited for you to be free to marry me. 10 years I believed your lies about your divorce being finalized soon. 10 years I wasted on a man who was never going to choose me because he already had a wife. The guests were starting to move now, some of them leaving in shock, others clustering in small groups to whisper about what they'd witnessed. I could see phones out, people texting furiously, spreading the news of Richard's downfall to everyone who hadn't been here to see it firsthand. His reputation was ruined. His career was over. His relationships with both his families were destroyed. Everything he'd built his life around was crumbling in real time, and he had no one to blame but himself. I'm going to take Emma home, Lisa announced, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. She doesn't need to see any more of this. As she turned to leave, Emma looked back at Richard with those big eyes that were so much like his. Are you really not my daddy? She asked in that innocent way children have, of cutting straight to the heart of things. Richard's face crumpled. I'm still your daddy, sweetheart, he said. That part was never a lie. But you lied about everything else, Emma said, and even at 7 years old, she understood that something fundamental had been broken. Lisa carried Emma away, and I knew I'd probably never see either of them again. They were victims in this, too, collateral damage from Richard's choices, and they deserved to build a new life free from the chaos he'd created. The party was effectively over now. Guests were leaving in small groups, some stopping to offer me awkward condolences, others just fleeing from the uncomfortable situation. The string quartet had packed up and left. The catering staff was quietly cleaning up the remains of what was supposed to be a celebration. Sarah was still crying in David's arms, and I knew she'd need time to process what she'd learned about her father. But she was strong, and she had David's support, and eventually she'd understand why I'd done this. Richard was still standing there with the legal papers in his hands, looking lost and broken. All his charm, all his confidence, all his ability to manipulate and deceive. None of it could help him now. I hope it was worth it, I said to him as I walked past to check on our daughter. He grabbed my arm, one last desperate attempt to get through to me. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so sorry for everything. I know I can't fix this, but I'm sorry. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd loved for 26 years. This man I'd built my life around. This man who'd destroyed everything we'd had together. I don't care, I said finally. Your apologies don't give me back 25 years of my life. They don't give Lisa back 10 years of hers. They don't give Emma back the father she thought she had. Save your apologies for someone who still believes anything you say. I pulled my arm free and walked away from him, toward my daughter and the life I was going to build without him. The months that followed were both the hardest and the most liberating of my life. Watching Richard's world fall apart was satisfying in a way I'd never expected, but rebuilding my own life from the ashes of our marriage was more difficult than I'd imagined. The legal proceedings moved quickly once everything came to light. Michael filed criminal charges for financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The district attorney's office was very interested in prosecuting a case with such clear evidence of systematic deception. Richard's financial planning business collapsed almost immediately. Word spread quickly through our small community about what he'd done, and no one wanted to trust their money to a man who'd been stealing from his own wife for years. His professional licenses were revoked, his reputation was destroyed, and his former clients started filing complaints about their own accounts. It turned out that Richard's fraud hadn't been limited to our family finances. He'd been skimming money from client accounts, too, using their retirement funds to cover the shortfalls he'd created by supporting two households. The full scope of his criminal activity was staggering. He was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement, 5 years for destroying so many lives, for stealing people's futures, for building his happiness on a foundation of lies. Lisa left town with Emma shortly after the engagement party. She couldn't face the embarrassment of having been the other woman, even though she'd had no idea that's what she was. Emma would grow up knowing her father was in prison, knowing he'd lied about everything, knowing that half her family history was built on deception. I felt guilty about that sometimes. Emma was an innocent child who didn't deserve to have her world destroyed by her father's choices. But I reminded myself that I wasn't the one who'd created this situation. Richard was the one who'd chosen to live a double life. I'd just chosen to expose it. Sarah struggled with the revelation about her father. For weeks after the party, she barely spoke to me, angry that I'd chosen to expose Richard's lies so publicly instead of handling it privately. She felt like I'd humiliated our family unnecessarily, like I'd destroyed her engagement party for revenge. You could have just divorced him quietly, she said during one of our painful conversations. Did you have to ruin my party? Did you have to make it so public? He needed to face consequences, I told her. If I'd handled it privately, he would have found a way to spin it, to make himself look like the victim. He would have told people that our marriage just didn't work out, that we grew apart, that these things happened. Everyone would have felt sorry for him. Maybe that would have been better, Sarah said. Maybe some things should stay private. But eventually, she started to understand. As the legal proceedings revealed the full extent of Richard's fraud, as she learned how much money he'd stolen from our family, as she realized how close we'd come to losing our house because of his lies, she began to see why I'd felt the need to expose him publicly. He wasn't just unfaithful, she said one day, months after the party. He was a criminal. He stole from us, from his clients, from everyone who trusted him. Yes, I said simply, and criminals should face consequences. The financial recovery was complicated and incomplete. Richard had spent most of the money he'd stolen, and what was left was tied up in legal proceedings. I managed to save our house, but our retirement savings were gone. Sarah's college fund was gone. Years of careful financial planning had been wiped out by Richard's selfishness, but I was free. For the first time in 3 months, I could go to bed at night without lying next to a man who was deceiving me. I could wake up in the morning without wondering what lies he'd tell me that day. I could build a life based on truth instead of illusion. 6 months after the engagement party, I started my own business. Second Bloom Events, I called it, a event planning company that specialized in helping people celebrate new beginnings. Divorce parties, career change celebrations, retirement send-offs, fresh start gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the skills I'd developed planning Sarah's engagement party, the party where I destroyed my marriage, to help other people celebrate their own new beginnings. Business was good. Word of mouth spread quickly in our community, partly because of my reputation for organization and attention to detail, but also because of the dramatic way I'd ended my marriage. People were curious about me, about the woman who'd been strong enough to expose her husband's lies so publicly. I didn't mind being known for that. Let people think of me as the woman who'd refused to be a victim, who'd taken control of her own story instead of letting someone else write it for her. Sarah's wedding was beautiful. A year after the engagement party disaster, she married David in a ceremony that was everything the engagement party should have been. Joyful, honest, full of love and hope for the future. I walked her down the aisle myself, wearing a dress the color of new spring leaves, and feeling proud of the woman my daughter had become. She'd processed her father's betrayal and chosen to focus on building her own marriage on a foundation of honesty and trust. Richard wasn't there, of course. He was still in prison, and even if he'd been free, Sarah had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. She'd changed her last name when she married David, shedding the final connection to the man who'd lied to her for her entire life. During her wedding reception, Sarah gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "A year ago, my family fell apart," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I learned that my father had been living a lie, that everything I thought I knew about marriage and commitment was built on deception. It was devastating, and for a while, I wondered if I could trust anyone enough to build a life with them." She looked at David, then at me. But I also learned something else. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's painful, even when it destroys something you thought was beautiful. My mother could have let me go on believing in a fairy tale, but instead she showed me what real integrity looks like. The reception was held in a garden similar to the one where Richard's lies had been exposed, but this time the celebration was genuine. This time, the love being celebrated was real, honest, built on truth instead of deception. I danced with Sarah, with David, with my sister Anna, who'd supported me through the worst months of my life. I laughed with friends who'd stood by me even after the scandalous way my marriage had ended. I felt lighter than I had in years, free from the weight of living with lies. Late that evening, as the reception was winding down, I found myself standing alone in the garden where Sarah and David had exchanged vows. The fairy lights were twinkling overhead, and I could hear the distant sound of music and laughter from the reception tent. For just a moment, I allowed myself to grieve for what I'd lost. 25 years of marriage, even a marriage built on lies, had been a significant part of my life. I grieved for the woman I'd been before I learned the truth, the woman who'd believed in the fairy tale we'd built together. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd found the strength to expose Richard's lies. Grateful that I'd refused to be a victim. Grateful that I'd been able to rebuild my life on my own terms. I thought about Lisa and Emma sometimes, wondering how they were doing, whether they'd been able to build a new life free from Richard's lies. I hoped Emma would grow up strong and resilient, that she'd learn to trust people who deserved her trust. I thought about Richard too, sitting in his prison cell, finally facing the consequences of his choices. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate requires too much energy, and I had better things to do with mine. But I didn't forgive him either. Some things are unforgivable, and 10 years of systematic deception is one of them. 2 years after the engagement party that destroyed my marriage, I was thriving. Second Bloom events had grown beyond my wildest expectations, and I'd been featured in several wedding magazines for my innovative approach to celebration planning. I'd also started speaking at women's empowerment events, telling my story to audiences who were inspired by my refusal to accept victimhood. The message was always the same. When someone betrays your trust, don't fight to keep them. Fight to free yourself. I spent 3 months living with the knowledge of my husband's betrayal before I took action. I would tell these audiences, 3 months of pretending everything was normal while my heart was breaking. But those 3 months taught me something important. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The responses were always powerful. Women would come up to me after my speeches, sharing their own stories of betrayal and asking how they'd found the courage to leave. I'd tell them what I'd learned, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear. I was terrified, I'd admit. Terrified of being alone after 25 years of marriage. Terrified of the financial consequences. Terrified of what people would think. But I was more terrified of living the rest of my life with a lie. Sarah graduated from law school and started working as a prosecutor, specializing in financial crimes. She said watching her father's case had inspired her to help other victims of fraud get justice. She'd taken the worst thing that happened to our family and turned it into her life's purpose. You taught me that victims don't have to stay victims, she told me, that sometimes fighting back is the only way to heal. I was proud of the woman she'd become, proud that she'd chosen to channel her pain into helping others instead of letting it make her bitter or cynical. My relationship with money had changed, too. After watching Richard steal our financial security for his own selfish purposes, I'd become much more careful about protecting my assets. I had my own accounts, my own credit cards, my own financial advisor. I would never again be vulnerable to someone else's financial betrayal. But I wasn't bitter about love itself. I'd started dating again, carefully and selectively, but with an open heart. I'd learned to spot the red flags I'd missed with Richard, the charm that was a little too smooth, the explanations that were a little too convenient, the stories that didn't quite add up. I met a man named Tom who was divorced himself, who understood the caution that comes from being betrayed by someone you loved. Our relationship was built on radical honesty from the beginning. We both knew what it was like to discover that someone you trusted had been lying to you. I want to know everything, I told him early in our relationship. Your ex-wife's name, why your marriage ended, what your financial situation is, whether you've ever had an affair. I want to know it all up front because I never want to be surprised again. Tom appreciated my directness. He'd been betrayed too, and he understood the need for transparency. We built our relationship slowly, checking each other's stories, meeting each other's friends and family, making sure we were both who we claimed to be. It was a different kind of love than what I'd had with Richard. Less naive, more tested, built on knowledge instead of illusion. But it was also deeper, more real, more satisfying because I knew it was genuine. 3 years after my marriage ended, Richard was released from prison on parole. I heard about it through Michael, who'd stayed involved in monitoring Richard's legal situation. He's been trying to contact you, Michael told me. Letters to your office, calls to your phone. I can get a restraining order if you want. I thought about it, but ultimately decided it wasn't necessary. Richard had lost the power to hurt me. His words couldn't touch me anymore because I no longer cared what he thought or felt or wanted. When he finally showed up at my office, I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting this conversation for months, dreading it and anticipating it in equal measure. He looked older, grayer, diminished by his time in prison and the collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. But he was still recognizably the man I'd married 26 years earlier, the man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "Richard." I didn't invite him to sit down, didn't offer him coffee, or pretend this was a social visit. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "I know it's too little, too late, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry for what I did to you, to Sarah, to Lisa, and Emma. I'm sorry for all of it." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but he seemed genuinely broken, genuinely remorseful. Prison had taken the fight out of him, stripped away the charm and confidence that had allowed him to lie so effectively for so many years. "Okay," I said simply. He seemed surprised by my lack of reaction. "That's it? Just okay?" "What did you expect?" I asked. "Did you think I'd forgive you? Did you think we could somehow rebuild our relationship?" I hoped. I hoped we could find some kind of peace between us. "I have peace," I told him. "I found it when I stopped caring what you thought or felt or wanted. Your apology doesn't change anything for me. It doesn't give me back the years you stole from me. It doesn't undo the damage you did to our daughter, to Lisa, to Emma. It's just words from a man whose words have no value to me anymore." Richard flinched like I'd slapped him. "I know I hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," I interrupted. "You destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment. For 25 years, I thought I knew you. I thought I could read you, understand you, predict your behavior. And I was completely wrong about everything. Do you understand how devastating that is? To realize that your entire adult life has been built on lies?" "I never meant—" "You never meant to get caught," I said, cutting him off again. "That's what you never meant. You were perfectly content to keep lying to me for the rest of our lives. You would have taken those lies to your grave if I hadn't discovered them." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the reality that I wasn't going to give him the absolution he was looking for. "What can I do?" he asked finally. "How can I make amends?" "You can leave me alone," I said. "You can stop trying to insert yourself back into my life. You can let me continue building something real and honest without the shadow of your lies hanging over it. And Sarah, our daughter, Sarah will make her own decisions about whether she wants a relationship with you. But my advice, don't expect anything. She's built a good life without you, and she doesn't need the chaos you bring." Richard nodded slowly, finally understanding that there was no path back to the life he'd destroyed. "I really am sorry," he said one more time. "I know you are," I replied. "But sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust. Sorry doesn't give back what you took from all of us." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the conversation and how I felt about seeing him again. I'd expected to feel angry or hurt, or maybe even sad for what we'd lost. Instead, I felt nothing. Richard had become a stranger to me, someone from my past who no longer had any power to affect my present or future. His apology was meaningless because I no longer cared whether he was sorry or not. That evening, I called Sarah to let her know about Richard's visit. "How do you feel about seeing him?" she asked. "Empty," I said honestly. "Like I was talking to someone I used to know a long time ago." He doesn't have any hold over me anymore. Good, Sarah said firmly. That's how it should be. He gave up the right to matter to us when he chose to live a lie. We talked for a while about Richard's attempt to reconnect, about whether Sarah wanted to see him or hear from him. She decided she didn't. She'd built a life without him, and she had no interest in reopening old wounds. I have a father-in-law who treats me like a daughter, she said. I have mentors and friends and people who've earned the right to be in my life. I don't need someone who lied to me for 25 years just because we share DNA. I was proud of her clarity, her strength, her refusal to accept toxicity just because it came from family. 5 years after the engagement party that changed everything, I was a completely different person than I'd been when I was married to Richard. Stronger, more independent, more confident in my own judgment. I'd learned to trust myself again, to believe in my ability to build something real and lasting. Second Bloom Events had become one of the most successful event planning companies in the region. I employed 12 people and had a waiting list of clients who wanted to work with me. I'd written a book about starting over after betrayal that had become a bestseller. I was regularly invited to speak at conferences and workshops, but the most important change was internal. I'd learned that I didn't need someone else to complete me, or validate me, or make my life meaningful. I was whole on my own, capable of creating joy and purpose and fulfillment without depending on anyone else. Tom and I had moved in together, but we maintained separate bank accounts and separate identities. We were partners, not dependents. We enhanced each other's lives without consuming them. I love that you don't need me, Tom told me one evening as we sat on the porch of the house I'd bought after my divorce was finalized. You want to be with me, but you don't need to be with me. That makes all the difference. He was right. I'd learned the difference between love and need, between partnership and dependence. I loved Tom, but I would be fine without him. That knowledge made our relationship stronger, not weaker. Sarah had her first baby that year, a beautiful little girl named Hope. When she asked me to be in the delivery room, I cried with gratitude and joy. Watching my daughter become a mother, seeing her create a family based on honesty and love and trust, felt like the ultimate victory over Richard's lies. I want to raise her to be like you, Sarah told me as we held Hope together in the hospital room. Strong, independent, unwilling to accept less than she deserves. Raise her to be like herself, I said, but teach her that she always has choices, even when those choices are hard. I thought about Emma sometimes, wondering what kind of woman she was growing up to be. She'd be 12 now, starting to understand the complexity of adult relationships, probably struggling with questions about her father and why he'd made the choices he had. I hoped Lisa had found love again, real love with someone who deserved her trust. I hoped Emma was resilient and strong, that she'd learned from her father's mistakes instead of being broken by them. Richard had tried to contact me a few more times over the years, usually around holidays or significant dates. I'd stopped responding entirely. There was nothing left to say between us, no relationship to repair or maintain. I'd heard through the gossip network in our small town that he was working at a grocery store, living in a small apartment, trying to rebuild some kind of life from the ruins of what he'd destroyed. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy about his circumstances. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. The last time someone mentioned seeing him, they said he looked old and tired, worn down by the weight of his mistakes. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd had 25 years to make different choices, to build something honest and real. Instead, he'd chosen deception and manipulation, and now he was reaping what he'd sown. On the fifth anniversary of the engagement party, I threw a celebration for myself and my friends. Not a bitter commemoration of Richard's downfall, but a joyful celebration of the life I'd built in the aftermath of his lies. 5 years ago, I thought my life was ending, I told the group gathered in my backyard. I thought losing my marriage meant losing everything. Instead, it meant gaining everything: my self respect, my independence, my ability to build something real and honest and lasting. The party was everything the engagement party should have been, full of genuine love and laughter, honest relationships, people who'd earned the right to be there. No lies, no hidden agendas, no secret families lurking in the shadows. As the evening wound down and my friends began to leave, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd confronted Richard 5 years earlier. But instead of anger and betrayal, I felt peace and gratitude. I'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turned it into the foundation for the best years of my life. I'd refused to be a victim, refused to let someone else's choices define my future, refused to accept anything less than the truth. When someone hides a double life, you have two choices. You can fight to keep them, accepting the lies and the betrayal because you're afraid of losing what you thought you had. Or you can fight to free yourself, choosing truth over comfort, reality over illusion. I chose freedom. I chose truth. I chose myself, and it was the best decision I ever made. If you believe in justice, that doesn't need shouting. If you believe that victims can become victors, if you believe that the truth is always worth fighting for, then you understand why I did what I did. Why I chose to expose Richard's lies publicly instead of suffering in silence. Why I chose to destroy the illusion in order to build something real. Because some things are worth more than keeping the peace. Some things are worth more than protecting someone else's reputation. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs you everything you thought you wanted. Truth is worth fighting for. Self-respect is worth fighting for. The right to build your life on a foundation of honesty instead of lies, that's worth fighting for. I fought for those things, and I won. Not because I destroyed Richard, but because I saved myself, and that's a victory worth celebrating.